There exists a particular species of nightmare that surpasses all others in its capacity to shatter our fundamental sense of security in the world. The nightmare of betrayal by those we trust most completely, most instinctively, most desperately. We place our children in the arms of pediatric nurses, believing they will protect the most precious lives we know. We commit our suffering loved ones to psychiatric hospitals, trusting that trained professionals will ease their pain rather than multiply it. We submit to the authority of physicians, allowing them to cut into our bodies, inject substances into our veins, reshape our very minds, because we must believe, that the white coat represents healing, that medical credentials guarantee benevolence, that the Hippocratic Oath means something sacred and inviolable. But what happens when that trust becomes the weapon? What happens when the asylum, that place meant to provide sanctuary for the broken and vulnerable, transforms into a hunting ground for predators wearing stethoscopes? We will meet the lobotomy evangelist who destroyed thousands of minds while being hailed as a genius, the organ thief who mutilated patients based on pseudoscience while publishing in prestigious journals, the pediatric nurse who murdered children to feed her hero complex while hospitals covered up her crimes, the CIA-funded psychiatrist who erased personalities in the name of national security while serving as president of international psychiatric associations. These doctors walked among us. They were honored, respected, trusted, and they left behind a trail of destroyed lives that should haunt us still. Dr. Walter Freeman, the lobotomy evangelist Walter Jackson Freeman II, was born into American medical aristocracy in 1895, the grandson of a prominent physician who'd served as personal doctor to 4 presidents, a lineage that seemed to predestine him for greatness in medicine. He graduated from Yale, earned his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania, completed advanced training in neurology at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Medicine, and by his early 30s had established himself as a rising star in American psychiatry, serving as chairman of the neurology department at George Washington University. He was brilliant, charismatic, ambitious, the kind of doctor who commanded rooms with his presence, who spoke with absolute confidence about complex neurological concepts, who made patients and colleagues alike feel they were in the presence of genius. He wore bow ties and carried himself with theatrical flair, understanding instinctively that medicine was as much performance as science, that inspiring confidence mattered as much as actual competence. When Freeman encountered the work of Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Muniz in the mid-1930s, work involving severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex to treat mental illness, he saw not just a medical procedure, but a revolution, a miracle cure for the thousands of patients warehoused in America's overcrowded, underfunded asylums. He partnered with neurosurgeon James Watts to perform the first prefrontal lobotomy in the United States in 1936, and initially, the results seemed promising. Some patients with severe, treatment-resistant mental illness showed improvement, became calmer, more manageable, able to function in ways they hadn't before. Freeman genuinely believed he was helping people, liberating them from the prison of their own minds, offering hope where none had existed. But Freeman wanted more than success. He wanted fame, recognition, a place in medical history. He wanted to democratize the lobotomy, to make it accessible not just to wealthy patients who could afford neurosurgeons, but to the masses of suffering people in state institutions. So he developed what he called the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure so simple, so quick, so barbaric in its elegance that it would come to define his legacy and destroy thousands of lives. He didn't need a neurosurgeon. He didn't need an operating room. He didn't even need proper anesthesia. All he needed was an ice pick, literally, an ice pick from his kitchen drawer, and 10 minutes. The procedure was grotesque in its simplicity. Freeman would render the patient unconscious using electroconvulsive shock, Then insert the ice pick through the thin bone of the eye socket, just above the eyeball, tapping it through with a small hammer. Once through the bone, he would sweep the instrument back and forth, severing the neural connections in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for personality, judgment, impulse control, everything that makes a person who they are. Then he'd repeat the process on the other side. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. Patients would wake up with black eyes and no memory of what had been done to them. Their personalities fundamentally altered, their futures irrevocably destroyed. Freeman performed his first transorbital lobotomy in 1946, and from that moment, he became an evangelist for the procedure, a traveling salesman of brain mutilation. He purchased a van, which he cheerfully called his lobotomobile, and drove across America, performing lobotomies in state hospitals, private clinics, even hotel rooms, anywhere he could find patients and doctors willing to watch. He would perform multiple procedures in a single day, sometimes as many as 25, moving from patient to patient with assembly line efficiency, inserting the ice pick, sweeping it back and forth, moving to the next victim. He took photographs of himself performing the procedure, always smiling, always confident. The ice pick held like a conductor's baton as he orchestrated the destruction of human consciousness. The media loved him. Life magazine featured him. Medical journals published his papers. He lectured at universities, trained other doctors in his technique, appeared on radio programs to discuss the miracle of lobotomy. He was hailed as a pioneer, a humanitarian, a man who'd found a cure for insanity itself. And desperate families, watching loved ones suffer in overcrowded asylums, seeing no other options, no other hope, consented to the procedure, trusted this confident, credentialed doctor who promised their difficult relatives would be fixed, made manageable, returned to them healed. But they weren't healed. They were destroyed. Rosemary Kennedy, sister of future President John F. Kennedy, underwent a lobotomy performed by Freeman in 1941 at age 23 because her father found her mood swings and mild rebelliousness embarrassing to the family's political ambitions. After the procedure, she was reduced to the mental capacity of a toddler, unable to speak coherently or care for herself, institutionalized for the rest of her life. Her vibrant personality erased to solve a problem that wasn't medical but social. Howard Dully was 12 years old in 1960 when his stepmother, tired of his typical adolescent behavior, convinced Freeman to lobotomize him. Dully survived but spent decades struggling with the consequences, his childhood stolen, his brain permanently altered because an adult found him inconvenient. These weren't isolated cases. They were representative of Freeman's patient population: difficult women, rebellious teenagers, gay men whose sexuality their families wanted cured, anyone whose behavior deviated from social norms, and whose relatives had the money or influence to have them fixed. Freeman performed over 3,500 lobotomies during his career, continuing long after the medical establishment had rejected the procedure as barbaric and ineffective, long after psychotropic medications offered real treatment for mental illness, long after hospitals began refusing him operating privileges. A lobotomized patient was docile, manageable, cheap to maintain. Insurance companies loved it because a one-time procedure cost less than years of hospitalization and treatment. Families loved it because it transformed their difficult relatives into compliant, emotionless shells who no longer caused trouble. And Freeman loved it because it made him famous, made him feel powerful, made him believe he was changing the world. No one seemed to care that the patients themselves, the human beings whose brains were being mutilated, lost everything that made life worth living. They were mentally ill, after all, locked in asylums, voiceless and powerless. Who would listen to them? Who would believe them? Who would hold Freeman accountable when everyone with power and influence benefited from his barbaric efficiency? The answer, for decades, was no one. And so he continued, ice pick in hand, smile on face, destroying minds in the name of healing, leaving behind a legacy of thousands of destroyed lives and the terrible knowledge that medicine, when wielded without accountability or genuine compassion, can become the cruelest weapon of all. Freeman's story reveals the seductive danger of the quick fix, the miracle cure, the simple solution to complex problems. Society wanted to believe that mental illness could be solved with a 10-minute procedure because the alternative, providing adequate funding for asylums, developing genuine treatments, accepting that some suffering cannot be easily eliminated, was too difficult, too expensive, too uncomfortable. We trusted Freeman because he was confident, credentialed, celebrated. We trusted him because trusting doctors is what we're taught to do. We trusted him because questioning medical authority feels dangerous, feels like rejecting expertise in favor of ignorance. And that trust, weaponized by a man more interested in fame than healing, became the instrument of mass mutilation. The lesson should have been learned. Charisma and credentials do not equal competence or compassion. But as our next case demonstrates, the medical establishment's capacity to protect its own overprotecting patients would prove even more deadly than one man's ambition. Dr. Henry Cotton, the organ thief Henry Andrews Cotton, graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1899, completed his psychiatric training at Johns Hopkins Hospital under the legendary Adolph Meyer, and by 1907, at the impossibly young age of 31, was appointed medical director of the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton, one of the largest psychiatric institutions in America. But Cotton took this theory to its logical extreme and then far, far beyond. He became convinced that mental illness was caused by hidden infections in teeth, tonsils, sinuses, stomachs, intestines, gallbladders, spleens, ovaries, cervixes, essentially any organ that could harbor bacteria. And if infection caused insanity, then the cure was obvious. Remove the infected parts. Cut them out. Excise the disease. Restore the mind. It was elegantly simple, appealingly scientific, and completely, catastrophically wrong. Cotton began with teeth. He kept meticulous statistics, but he falsified them, counting deaths from surgical complications as cures, because the patient was no longer exhibiting symptoms of mental illness. They were dead. He counted patients who showed any improvement, no matter how slight or temporary, as successes. He ignored or dismissed the thousands of patients who were left mutilated, in chronic pain, physically disabled, and still mentally ill. Cotton's conviction was so complete that he practiced on himself and his own family. When he developed depression, he had his own teeth removed. When that didn't cure him, he had his tonsils, sinuses, and sections of his colon removed. But in 1925, a statistical investigation was finally conducted by Dr. Phyllis Greenacre, a researcher sent by Adolph Meyer, Cotton's own former mentor, who'd grown concerned about rumors of high mortality rates at Trenton. Greenacre's report was damning. She found that Cotton's claimed cure rates were fabricated, that his mortality rates were catastrophically high, that patients who survived were often worse off than before surgery, and that there was no scientific evidence supporting his focal infection theory as applied to mental illness. She recommended that Cotton's surgical program be immediately shut down and that he be removed from his position. The response from the medical establishment and the state of New Jersey was not to act on Greenacre's findings, but to suppress them. Her report was buried. Cotton was defended by the hospital board, by state officials, by colleagues who'd built their own reputations on his work and couldn't afford to admit they'd been wrong. Meyer himself, despite commissioning the investigation, backed away from its conclusions, unwilling to publicly condemn his former protege and admit that his own judgment had been so catastrophically flawed. Cotton continued as medical director, continued operating, continued mutilating patients for another 8 years. He finally retired in 1933, not in disgrace, but with honors, celebrated for his years of service, his innovative approach, his dedication to helping the mentally ill. He died later that same year, eulogized as a pioneer and humanitarian, his victims forgotten, his crimes unpunished, his legacy protected by an establishment more concerned with its own reputation than with justice or accountability. The thousands of patients he'd mutilated, those who survived at least, were left to live with destroyed bodies, chronic pain, permanent disabilities, and the knowledge that the medical system had valued a doctor's reputation more than their lives, their suffering, their right to bodily integrity. No one was ever held accountable. But admitting the truth would have meant acknowledging that respected institutions had enabled mass mutilation, that prestigious medical journals had published pseudoscience, that the entire system designed to protect vulnerable patients had catastrophically failed. So instead, they protected cotton, suppressed investigations, and allowed the horror to continue for decades. The patients had no power, no voice, no ability to protect themselves. They were locked in an asylum, declared insane, legally stripped of their rights. Who would believe them over a Harvard-educated doctor with powerful allies? When she worked the pediatric intensive care unit at Behar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, starting in 1978, her colleagues saw her as someone who genuinely cared, who would sit with dying children when no one else would, who seemed to take their deaths personally, weeping openly, staying late to comfort grieving parents. But there was something odd about Janine Jones, patterns that should have raised alarms, but were instead rationalized, dismissed, or ignored. Children seemed to experience unexpected medical crises with unusual frequency during her shifts, sudden cardiac arrests, unexplained bleeding, respiratory failures that came out of nowhere. The pediatric ICU saw a dramatic spike in emergency codes when Jones was working, far beyond what statistics would predict. And Jones was always there, always the first to respond, always ready with a crash cart and emergency medications, always fighting heroically to save the child she'd just poisoned. Because that's what Janine Jones was doing. She was deliberately inducing medical emergencies in the children under care, injecting them with dangerous drugs, digoxin to cause cardiac arrest, heparin to cause uncontrolled bleeding, succinylcholine to cause respiratory paralysis, and then rescuing them, playing the hero, basking in the praise and attention that came from saving a child's life. It was Munchausen syndrome by proxy taken to its most extreme and deadly conclusion. She was creating emergencies to satisfy her pathological need to be seen as a savior, to be the center of attention during codes, to be the one parents thanked through their tears when their child survived. Except many children didn't survive. The exact number of Janine Jones's victims will never be known with certainty. Estimates range from 15 to 60 or more, because her killing spree continued for years across multiple hospitals, and many of the deaths were attributed to the children's underlying medical conditions rather than to deliberate poisoning. These were already sick children. After all, fragile infants and toddlers in intensive care units, children whose deaths, while tragic, weren't entirely unexpected. Jones exploited this, understanding that a sudden deterioration in an already critical patient would be seen as unfortunate, but not necessarily suspicious. One of her confirmed victims was 15-month-old Chelsea Ann McClellan, who was brought to a clinic where Jones was working in September 1982 for a routine checkup. Chelsea was a healthy, happy toddler. Nothing wrong with her beyond some mild cold symptoms. Jones gave her an injection, supposedly a routine immunization, and within minutes, Chelsea went into seizures. She was rushed to a hospital where she died. The cause of death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, and Chelsea's parents, devastated, tried to move forward with their grief. But the doctor who'd been treating Chelsea, Kathleen Holland, grew suspicious when she noticed that multiple children had experienced unexplained emergencies in her clinic, and all of them had occurred when Janine Jones was present. Another victim was infant Rolando Santos, who died in Bexar County Hospital's pediatric ICU in 1981 after a series of unexplained bleeding episodes during Jones's shifts. His death was attributed to complications from his underlying medical condition, but years later, when Jones's crimes were finally investigated, forensic analysis would reveal that he'd been injected with massive doses of heparin, a blood thinner that caused him to bleed to death internally while Jones stood by, pretending to try to save him. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look. Children coded when Jones was working. They didn't code when she wasn't. Emergency medications went missing from the unit when Jones was on duty. Vials of drugs were found with needle punctures that shouldn't have been there. The trial revealed the horrific scope of her crimes. The deliberate poisonings, the pattern of emergencies during her shifts, the missing medications, the testimony from other nurses who'd suspected but been silenced by hospital administration. In 1984, she was convicted and sentenced to 99 years in prison for murder and 60 years for injury to a child, sentences to be served concurrently, making her eligible for mandatory release in 2018 under Texas law at the time. But the story didn't end there. How many children died because Bexar County Hospital chose to quietly transfer a suspicious nurse rather than investigate and report her? How many families buried children without ever knowing they'd been murdered? How many other hospitals did Jones potentially work at before Kerrville, leaving trails of dead children in her wake? The answers are unknowable, lost to time and institutional cover-ups. But what is known is that Janine Jones killed children for years, that hospitals knew something was wrong, and that they chose to protect themselves from liability rather than protect the children under their care. The parents of her victims have spoken of the particular horror of their betrayal. They trusted nurses with their children's lives, believed that hospitals were safe places, that medical professionals would protect their babies. Instead, they placed their most precious treasures in the hands of a serial killer, and the institutions that should have stopped her instead enabled her to continue, valuing corporate reputation and fear of lawsuits over the lives of children. Some parents spent years believing their children had died of natural causes, only to learn decades later that they'd been murdered, that their grief had been compounded by lies, that justice had been delayed by cowardice and self-interest. Jones's crimes reveal the deadly consequences of institutional self-protection and the particular vulnerability of those who cannot speak for themselves. Children in ICUs, infants who cannot articulate what's being done to them, patients whose deaths can be attributed to underlying conditions. These are the perfect victims for a predator in medical disguise. And when hospitals prioritize avoiding lawsuits over protecting patients, when administrators choose to quietly transfer problem employees rather than investigate and report them, when corporate healthcare values profit and reputation over human lives, monsters like Janine Jones can kill with impunity, moving from hospital to hospital, leaving trails of small bodies in their wake. The hero complex that drove her, the pathological need to be needed, to be praised, to be the center of attention during emergencies, is a recognized psychological pattern. But recognizing it requires institutions willing to look, willing to investigate, willing to prioritize patient safety over everything else. Bexar County Hospital wasn't willing, and children died because of it. But if Jones represents the evil of individual pathology enabled by institutional cowardice, our final case reveals something even more disturbing. The evil of state-sponsored torture disguised as research, of government-funded atrocities committed by the most respected psychiatrist of his generation, of systematic human experimentation that destroyed lives in the name of national security. Dr. Ewan Cameron, the mind eraser Donald Ewan Cameron was, by any conventional measure, the most distinguished psychiatrist of the mid-20th century. Born in Scotland in 1901, educated at the University of Glasgow, he emigrated to North America and built a career of such remarkable achievement that his credentials read like a fantasy of professional success. Founding chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University, director of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, president of the American Psychiatric Association, president of the World Psychiatric Association, president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, founding member of the World Federation for Mental Health. He published prolifically, lectured internationally, trained generations of psychiatrists, and was universally respected as a giant in his field, a man whose opinions shaped the direction of psychiatric treatment across the Western world. He was also a torturer who destroyed minds in the name of science, who reduced functioning human beings to helpless infants through systematic abuse disguised as research, who took vulnerable people seeking help for minor psychological issues and left them permanently brain damaged, unable to recognize their own families, unable to perform basic functions, their entire personalities erased and replaced with nothing. They gave Cameron funding, resources, and most importantly, they gave him complete freedom from oversight, from ethical review, from any accountability for what he did to his patients. And Cameron, convinced of his own genius, absolutely certain that he was pioneering revolutionary treatments that would transform psychiatry, began his experiments. His victims were not enemy agents or criminals. They were ordinary people, mostly women, who came to the Allen Memorial Institute seeking help for minor psychological issues: postpartum depression, anxiety, work stress, marital problems. They were told they would receive cutting-edge treatment from one of the world's leading psychiatrists. They had no idea they were about to become subjects in government-funded experiments in personality destruction. Cameron's technique, which he called depatterning, involved multiple forms of intensive assault on the brain and psyche. Patients would be placed in drug-induced comas for weeks or months at a time, kept unconscious through massive doses of barbiturates and other sedatives, their bodies wasting away while their minds floated in chemically induced oblivion. During these comas, Cameron would administer electroconvulsive therapy, electroshock treatment, at intensities 30 to 40 times higher than standard therapeutic levels, inducing seizures so severe they caused memory loss, brain damage, and in some cases, fractured bones from the violence of the convulsions. He would give patients massive doses of LSD and other experimental drugs, observing their reactions, documenting their psychological breakdowns. When patients were conscious, Cameron would subject them to sensory deprivation, placing them in isolation chambers for extended periods, depriving them of sight, sound, touch, any stimulation that might allow them to maintain a sense of self. Or he would do the opposite. Sensory overload, strapping patients down, placing headphones on them that played recorded messages on endless loops, sometimes Cameron's own voice, sometimes the patient's own voice recorded during therapy sessions, playing the same phrases over and over hundreds of times per day for weeks. You are a good mother. You are a good mother. You are a good mother. Or, you are worthless. You are worthless. You are worthless. The content didn't seem to matter to Cameron. What mattered was the repetition, the assault on consciousness, the breaking down of existing thought patterns. What Cameron discovered, had he been honest enough to admit it, was that human personality cannot be erased and rebuilt like reformatting a computer hard drive. What he actually accomplished was permanent brain damage, the destruction of memory and cognitive function, the reduction of healthy, functioning adults to states of permanent childlike dependency. His patients didn't emerge with new, healthier personalities. They emerged, those who survived at least, as shells, unable to work, unable to maintain relationships, unable to function independently. their lives destroyed, their families devastated. One victim, Madeline Smith, entered the Allen Memorial Institute in 1957, suffering from mild postpartum depression after the birth of her fifth child. She was a functioning wife and mother, experiencing normal adjustment difficulties. After 6 months of Cameron's treatment, induced comas, intensive electroshock, LSD, sensory deprivation, tape loop messages, she emerged unable to recognize her husband or children, unable to remember anything about her life, unable to feed or dress herself. She never recovered. She spent the rest of her life in a state of permanent cognitive impairment, requiring full-time care, her family destroyed, her children growing up without a functioning mother, all because she'd sought help for postpartum depression. Ewan Cameron, the mind eraser Mary Morrow, entered for treatment of anxiety in 1959. After Cameron's deep-patterning protocol, she could no longer remember her wedding day, the births of her children, her own childhood. She had to relearn how to walk, how to use utensils, how to read. She never regained her memories, never fully recovered her cognitive abilities, spent decades struggling with basic tasks that had once been automatic. Her husband described it as watching his wife die while her body remained alive, as being married to a stranger who wore his wife's face but possessed none of her personality, her memories, her essence. These weren't isolated cases. They were representative of Cameron's entire patient population during this period. An estimated 150 to 300 people underwent his experimental treatments, and the vast majority were left with permanent damage ranging from significant memory loss to complete personality destruction. Some committed suicide, unable to live with what had been done to them. Others required lifelong institutional care. Many simply struggled through decades of diminished capacity, trying to rebuild lives from fragments of memory, trying to reconnect with families who'd become strangers, trying to understand why the doctor they trusted had destroyed them. Cameron himself seemed to feel no remorse, no doubt about his methods. He published papers describing his techniques, presented at conferences, trained other psychiatrists in his approach. He genuinely believed he was pioneering revolutionary treatments, that the damage he was causing was temporary and necessary, that eventually he'd perfect the technique of erasing and rebuilding personality. He died in 1967, while mountain climbing in the Adirondacks, still respected in his field, still celebrated as a psychiatric pioneer, never held accountable for the lives he'd destroyed, never forced to answer for his crimes against the patients who trusted him. The truth about MKUltra and Cameron's role in it didn't emerge until the 1970s, when investigative journalists and congressional hearings began exposing the CIA's covert programs. In 1988, the Canadian government finally agreed to a settlement, paying $100,000 to each of approximately 80 victims, a pittance compared to the destroyed lives, and available only to those who could prove they'd been subjected to Cameron's experimental treatments, which was difficult given the destroyed records and the victims' own memory loss. The United States government never compensated Cameron's victims, never officially acknowledged its role in funding his experiments, never apologized for using vulnerable psychiatric patients as guinea pigs in mind control research. Why did institutions allow Cameron to operate with such freedom? Because he was prestigious, because his credentials were impeccable, because challenging someone of his stature felt impossible, because the CIA wanted the research and didn't care about the human cost, because McGill University benefited from his reputation and the research funding he brought in, because the psychiatric profession was more interested in protecting one of its most celebrated members than in protecting vulnerable patients, and because the victims were psychiatric patients, people already marginalized, already disbelieved, already stripped of credibility by virtue of seeking mental health treatment. The collaboration between government intelligence agencies and medical professionals in Cameron's case reveals perhaps the darkest possibility of all, that the very institutions meant to protect citizens, governments, universities, medical establishments, can become enablers of torture and human experimentation when national security or institutional prestige is invoked as justification. Cameron wasn't a rogue practitioner operating in the shadows. He was the president of international psychiatric associations, conducting his experiments at a prestigious university hospital, with government funding and institutional blessing. The message was clear: institutional prestige matters more than individual suffering. Protecting the reputation of medicine matters more than justice for those medicine has harmed. 4 doctors, for different eras, methods, motivations. Yet the pattern is unmistakable, repeated across decades and continents. Absolute power combined with zero accountability. Medical authority weaponized against the vulnerable. Institutions that valued reputation over human lives. And systems that protected predators while abandoning victims. Walter Freeman, Henry Cotton, Janine Jones, Ewan Cameron. They weren't monsters in the shadows. They were respected professionals, celebrated innovators, trusted caregivers. Freeman was hailed as a genius. Cotton published in prestigious journals. Jones was seen as a dedicated nurse. Cameron was president of international psychiatric associations. They operated openly within established institutions, with the knowledge and often the explicit support of colleagues, administrators, and government agencies. They weren't aberrations. They were products of systems that prioritized authority over accountability, that valued credentials over compassion, that protected the powerful while rendering the vulnerable voiceless. The victims were those society had already marginalized, the mentally ill locked in asylums with no legal rights and no ability to refuse treatment. Children, unable to articulate what was being done to them. And the systems that enabled these doctors, the deference to medical authority, the institutional self-protection, the marginalization of vulnerable patients, the prioritization of reputation over accountability. Those systems still exist. We want to believe this could never happen again, that modern oversight and ethical review boards and patients' rights movements have created safeguards that would prevent such horrors. But every system is only as strong as the people operating it, and every safeguard can be circumvented by those with sufficient authority, credentials, and institutional protection. The fundamental dynamics remain. Doctors still occupy positions of enormous trust and power. Vulnerable populations still exist, still depend on medical systems that don't always prioritize their well-being. Institutions still have powerful incentives to protect their reputations rather than admit failures. And we still, as a society, want to believe that the white coat represents healing, that credentials guarantee competence and compassion, that those we trust with our lives and minds deserve that trust. The doctors in these stories walked among us, wore the same white coats, spoke the same language of medical authority, operated within the same respected institutions. They shook hands with colleagues, published papers, trained students, received awards. And they destroyed thousands of lives while the systems meant to stop them instead protected them, enabled them, celebrated them. The asylums are still there, though we call them by different names now. The vulnerable are still there, still dependent on systems that don't always protect them. The potential for abuse is still there, embedded in the power dynamics of medicine, in the trust we must place in those who treat us, in the systems that value reputation over truth. The demons didn't come from outside. They came from within, wearing white coats and carrying stethoscopes, speaking with authority and confidence, trusted and respected until the evidence of their crimes became too overwhelming to ignore. And even then, even when the truth emerged, the systems protected them, the institutions defended them, and the victims were left to suffer in silence, their destroyed lives considered less important than preserving the reputation of medicine itself. That is the true horror, Not that monsters exist, but that we give them white coats and call them healers, that we build systems that protect them over their victims, that we value authority over accountability until the body count becomes impossible to ignore. The asylums where doctors became demons weren't aberrations. They were reflections of what happens when power meets vulnerability with no meaningful oversight, when trust becomes a weapon, when healing becomes harm. And somewhere, right now, another vulnerable person is placing their trust in a system that may not deserve it, in a professional who may not honor it, in institutions that may value reputation over their well-being. The white coat still inspires trust. Medical authority still commands deference. The vulnerable still have nowhere else to turn. We should remember that. We should remember the thousands of destroyed minds, the mutilated bodies, the murdered children, the erased personalities. We should remember that the greatest horrors in medical history weren't committed by obvious monsters, but by respected professionals operating within celebrated institutions. We should remember that trust, when misplaced, becomes the most effective weapon of all. Because forgetting means it could happen again. And perhaps, in ways we haven't yet recognized, it already is.